making a giant island. This slow, gradual, incremental process is so Lyell, but also so Darwin. And his theory of evolution is exactly the same way. How did all these wonderfully shaped living things come to be? Exactly that kind of process. Endless series of tiny little incremental changes. Very consistent. Okay, so it's important for you to remember some things that this book does not address. It is probably one of the most widely misunderstood and most widely misrepresented books in the world. So, the book does not address the origin of life. It's nothing to do with Darwin's book. But some people are misled by the title that think origin of species means origin of life. It does not address that. It doesn't know anything about it. That's not his topic. He's talking about where new species come from. They come from earlier ones. What is the origin of life? I don't know. That's what Darwin says. Does God exist? He doesn't talk about that. But he does mention the Creator several times in the book. Which is why I say, so yes, is God ultimately behind nature? He strongly implies yes. And we know from later recollections that at the time he wrote this book, he firmly believed that there was a Creator out there. So if you've heard someone say that it's an atheistical book, that's not true. Darwin was not an atheist. It was not an atheistical book. Although many people saw it that way. Many people did. Okay, so when you open the book and you turn to the first page, you see these two epigraphs, which I'm sure you remember that an epigraph is a quotation at the beginning of a book or article. First one by William Here's a little challenge. How many of you can pronounce that surname? The man in the front, Mr. W. Get a prize if you can get. Fine, try it. Good try, I think so too. No. Yes, Whewell, William Whewell. I think I may have given that away in an earlier lecture. But well done. Yes, William Whewell, who was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, and was known as a great polymath. He was an expert at everything. And he had written this Bridgewater treatise. Remember, we talked a lot about Buckland's book on geology in the same series, the Bridgewater treatises. Earl of Bridgewater was a rich man who was interested in science, who died, who left a big pot of money for scientists to write books, update and page, basically. Anyway, so Whewell wrote one, and Darwin shows this line to put at the front of his book. Let's have a look at it. He wrote, but with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interpositions of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws. Remember when I told you last time about the difference between first cause and secondary laws? Well, this is the same thing. In other words, what Whewell is saying, the reason Darwin has put this here is very strategic. He's super respectable. No one could doubt how respectable and safe Professor Whewell is. What he's saying is that what we know about how nature works is that events are brought about not by isolated events of divine power, that's God going zap, 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 and making new species. No, it says, but by the establishment of general laws. This is very Victorian, they all believe this, Darwin as well, that God had set up the laws of nature in such a way that they were so brilliant and so clever that they worked on their own. And all of nature, the planets spiraling through the heavens and worms crawling through the moist earth, all of them are the result of natural laws, which science can discover. So Darwin puts that at the front to say, what basically what he's saying is, my book isn't irreligious, even though you might think so. And here's Professor Whewell saying that. In fact, I think Whewell later was pretty annoyed when he saw the quote of his book was put at the top of this. And apparently he kept this book out of the college library of Trinity, Cambridge, for the remainder of his years as master there, because he didn't like it. The second one is from Bacon, he's from centuries before. Bacon was a contemporary of Shakespeare. In fact, he didn't invent bacon though. And some conspiracy theorists like to say that the works of Shakespeare were actually written by Bacon, which, between you and me, is a little rubbish. Because Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, not Bacon. But he was also, by this time, considered to be a sort of founding father figure in science. And his quote says something similar. So true, therefore, that no man out of a weak conceit of sobriety, or an ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word, that's the Bible, or in the book of God's works, that's nature. Divinity or philosophy, we would now say science. But rather let men endeavor an endless progression of proficiency in both. So the message Darwin is putting out here is, it's fair game to study nature as far as it goes, because God made that too. It's not irreligious to pursue nature all the way. Oh, by the way, this is one of the ways you can tell if it's the first edition, because only the first edition has 2 epigraphs at the front, all the other ones have 3. Just in case. Okay. So now I'll talk a little bit about the chapters. So the first chapter is called Variation of Investigation. And he looks at the ubiquity of natural variations. Do you understand what the natural variations are? Because this has to be absolutely clear in your minds, otherwise you won't understand the rest of it. The natural variations are all the little tiny differences between every 2 organisms. So, and all organisms, plants and animals. So you can have 2 seeds, or you can have 2 people, it doesn't matter. All the little things that are different are variations. Okay? And he wants to make the point to his reader that these variations are everywhere. They are constantly there. Because that is what natural selection will, as it were, select. So he uses an analogy between artificial selection, which is what breeders and farmers do. They, as it were, artificially select or choose which plants or which animals to breed from by choosing the variations they want. I usually mention external examples because they're most accessible, but people also chose internal ones, such as disease resistance or speed, or indeed the amount of fat in the meat of beef. So in Darwin's day, they like to have lots of marbling of fat going into the meat because it's more juicy that way. And so Darwin said, even though someone kills a cow to get the meat, the farmer can still constantly go to the same family, knowing he will find the same kind of meat in the other ones. They can keep breeding from them and acquire the desired characteristic, whatever it is, inside or out. So then he discusses the many interesting pigeon breeds, which instead of being the whole book is just this chapter. And he made the argument that all of these different kinds of crazy breeds, of which I showed you just 3, he argued that they were all descended from one common ancestor, the normal wild rock pigeon, which is the normal pigeon that you saw on the street, which is just the normal motley little, those little flying rats that you see all over cities around the world. That's what we're talking about, wild pigeons. Now the breeders in Darwin's day tended to think that they were all derived from a different wild ancestor. So Darwin was arguing that it wasn't just a bunch of straight lines, but it was a branching tree derived from a common ancestor. Darwin also introduced other kinds of causes. What we usually only remember Darwin for natural selection, but he actually introduces a number of other things. So, for example, because they didn't know about DNA or genes, there was something he called the correlation of growth. You see that here? Which is things like he was told that white cats with blue eyes are deaf. I actually don't know if this is true, but Darwin believed it was true. So there was something about when you had certain characteristics in an organism, something else would follow. That was called correlation of growth, which were correlated. Which of course had something to do with genetics that Darwin and his contemporaries couldn't understand. And his other big theory, of course, is sexual selection. I'll mention that in a second. So the point is making it that the breeds or the races that people make, domesticated plants and animals, are being made by humans with the identical or with the analogous process whereby species, variety of species are formed in nature. So, yes, here's some more of these fancy pigeons. The only one I can ever remember is the pouter, this puffed out chest. Oh, and that one at the bottom left is called the fantail. I can't remember the name, but it doesn't reach. And here's a picture of a gentleman's shirt. So you can well imagine Darwin would fit right in here. Look at those nice pages. Okay. So, Darwin's other theory, apart from natural selection, which we'll spend most of the time talking about, is sexual selection. Sexual selection, Darwin described it as a different process whereby organisms come to be shaped the way they are. So why does a rooster have spurs on its legs? Or why does an animal have horns or antlers for males to fight? Why do they have these structures? Darwin argued that, well, if they didn't, if you took the spurs or the horns away from one of these animals, they would be in a terrible condition to compete with other males to get access to the females. So their attributes wouldn't be passed on. So having good spurs or good antlers or whatever it is another kind of selection, that animals are being selected by virtue of their ability to do two things. Compete with other males by bashing their heads in or whatever it happens to be, slashing their throats, in case of spurs, or persuading females to choose you. Female choice. That was very controversial for Darwin's colleagues because they were all old-fashioned misogynists back then, and they didn't think that women made any important decisions, or they certainly shouldn't anyway. And so Darwin's theory that females shaped a large part of biological evolution, that didn't go down well at all. But nowadays it's very well attested. And of course I have some data out of this to demonstrate this, see if they work.
Often the only signs of life are what you hear. The male blue bird of paradise is advertising for a mate. It's quite a performance, but he's not the only bird of paradise here keen to make an impression. There are nearly 40 different kinds on the island of New Guinea, each with a display seemingly more bizarre than the rest. A rifle bird of paradise. Like many jungle animals, birds of paradise avoid competing with each other, and these do so.
Now, of course, you understand how to translate that bird language, don't you? It's very you're saying, hey baby, check me out. To all the girl birds flying around the bushes there. That is, I'm not joking, that is what he's saying. He's saying, hey, look at me. My feathers are gorgeous. Come take a closer look. That is what they're saying. Watch it for the next one. Just keep that in mind. That's not a joke. That is what the bird is saying.
I live in different parts of this jungle-covered island. The sixth bird of paradise displays in his special clearing on the forest floor. The magnificent bird of paradise favours the low branches of bushes. His female is modestly dressed.
Not inside yellow.
The male has a good set of lungs, but he'll have to do more than flutter his eyelids if he wants to impress her. It'll all depend on his performance. The females may be dull-looking, but they're very picky. And it's time for a really close inspection.
Oh, he's got his hopes up.
His right side looks fine, but what about his left? Pretty impressive, but is he magnificent enough? Oh dear, her departure says it all. Generations of choosy females have driven the evolution of these remarkable displays. The more extravagant a male is, the more likely he will be noticed.
What's that, sir? Oh, it's another bird. What the hell?
He's so ugly.
Oh my god, where's the head?
That's the head.
Maybe that was a bit too aggressive.
Oh, that was fucking freaky.
He's so ugly. Oh my god, this kind of thing actually exists.
Now, you may not have heard Sir David's words at the end of that clip there, but the point is that the feathers and the all dance procedure and so forth has
Yeah, I
evolved
will email during the break.
because it works. In other words, the males are doing everything they possibly can to impress a female, to choose him. So, although Darwin calls sexual selection a different cause from natural selection, it's actually the same thing. It's a, sort of a subversion, a subset of natural selection, really, because it's different. It just happens to be some slightly different criteria by which some animals leave off offspring rather than others. And in these particular cases, it's those that can impress the females to choose them. And they get to mate with the female, and then their genes, which are responsible for all those feathers and the dance and all the other things. And there's more to it than just the feathers, because a bird has to be quite fit. In order to do this, he has to be able to find enough food in the forest, to waste his days doing nothing, dancing around chasing girls. He has to be able to, he has to be healthy and free of disease, keep his plumage so pretty. It's not an accident, it's a very good indicator. The colors, the cleanliness, the fitness, and the dance, and all of it, showing that this is a top male. But the females, of course, they're birds. They're stupid. They don't know, females are like, she's not calculating all of that at all. They really are impressed by the visual appearance. So the male is flaunting his stuff to impress the female. But they're only impressed by things that are truly, worth flaunting, basically. Because they are not impressed by males whose plumage is not so good or not so good at dancing. But even that one, the one we saw there, the Magnificent who got rejected, he looked pretty gorgeous to me, but she flew off, he wasn't good enough. So imagine that being reiterated thousands and millions of times, year after year. The finest amount of difference is being chosen between those birds by very discerning females. And the result of that, for thousands and thousands of years, has been the gradual formation of these exquisite creatures. Now they live on islands like New Guinea and the islands around there, which is why Wallace was there. We were shooting them all to sell for their feathers. But they live there because they can go this pathway of these extraordinary displays because there's basically no land predators there. They didn't reach them. So that's why you don't have such gorgeous and outlandish birds everywhere. Okay, here's another one. And it's the greater bird of paradise. And I think this one makes the point even clearer. Edinburgh Paradise. I'll just play the file itself. Sexual selection. Edinburgh Paradise.
Almost certainly a female, because the males are starting the second stage of the performance, the bow, head down. The female has hopped onto the perch of the male of her choice. That's a straight invitation to mate. Act 3, the approach, head up. Act 4, the first physical contact.
That's the name.
Yeah, colourful one.
That's good.
Keep flapping the wings around us.
Yeah,
The
that's
female like don't give a fuck.
Hi, that's
That's how I treat you.
no.
Then you like, see, the female like don't give a fuck. That's how I treat you every day.
It looks rough, but presumably she likes this sort of treatment. She could easily look away if she didn't.
Female like just doing.
Oh my god.
And that's it.
That's it. Next.
And now there's another to be attended to. Apparently, there's a
another
queue on this particular perch.
Oh my god, it's really like.
Oh my god, it's damn good.
So, is that.
Damn good.
So, what? Like the male.
This like, that's how the female likes it.
This is all he does as a father. Now she'll fly away and raise her young unaided.
Oh.
The males on the other perches, in spite of all their efforts, have no success at all.
But he's more attractive than you.
He's at it again.
Yeah. That's right.
But his partner is not reacting properly. She's facing away from him. He's got it wrong. This is a young male. Kids are taking place on this perch with this male. But are the females choosing the perch or the dancer? It's difficult to tell. But it's easy to see why these wonderful plumes should be so treasured by local people, and why indeed, when the first examples arrived in Europe in the 16th century, they should have created a sensation, as they did. Those first specimens had been prepared in the traditional way and had neither wings nor feet, and the books of the time showed them that way.
Okay, well, I don't show. I'm just showing you the rest of that documentary. Well, that's a really good one. Edinburgh Paradise is probably on YouTube by now. Gone a bit over, so if you would like your break today, would you? Yes, I think so. Okay, 5
I think
minutes.
actually really can't make them really don't know.
Like, it makes it fun.
Okay, let's see here.
I have to read a little bit, but
After he's gonna eat at science.
and
Are you hungry?
actually not very
Actually very fast, 14 more.
I'm not very hungry though. I didn't know what time we sleep last night.
About 4. female, John. His name is John. John Van Wyatt.
How do you say?
Come on, please. Okay, I'll have to start galloping rather quickly through these slides because there's a lot of material I'm not going to get to the end unless I go rather quickly. But I'm more than welcome questions and discussion and so forth. During the breaks and after the lectures, I'm free, so if you don't understand something or if I didn't make something clear enough, please come and talk to me. Okay, so moving on. We're only on chapter 2 of the book. So, plants and animals naturally vary. There's a clear distinction, he says. There is no clear distinction between species and varieties. In fact, experts often do not agree whether something was a species or a variety, which was ammunition for Darwin because it showed that it was an arbitrary distinction about whether one decided whether something was a race or a species. And this hierarchical pattern that we've been mentioning all the way back to Linnaeus, Darwin now says, I can explain this. Why is all nature arranged in these tree-like patterns of hierarchical categories? And that's because Darwin overlay the taxonomic diagram with the tree of life genealogical diagram to show that they The reason that categorization looks like that is because this is an accurate picture of how they actually descended and branched off from one another. It's not just some arbitrary form of organizing things. Okay, chapter 3, struggle for existence. This is where Malthus comes in about the likelihood of things overproducing and filling up the entire earth. They never do because almost all of them are being killed off. You will remember my example of the starlings in my back garden. Right? Every year, loads of baby birds being born, and a few of them are not cautious enough, and they get taken out by my cat and all the other cats, and every other back garden everywhere else. Keeping the birds wild, wary, and with quick reflexes. Because any that buried off in another direction, such as being a bit stupid, or not very wary, a bit sluggish, a bit slow, they're cat food. They're gone. And this is the struggle for existence as Darwin would describe it. You can read the quote later, looking at chapter 4. Natural selection. Okay, so this is how Darwin explains how living things come to be adapted. Vestiges and Lamarck couldn't really explain this, especially the complex interrelations between different species, that they could be co-adapted to one another. And Darwin argues that his theory can explain this. And he also makes the point that natural selection cannot modify one species solely for the good of another species. That's impossible. It might have something, it might evolve something that's partially good for another. Say, for example, flowers have evolved to produce this stuff called nectar, which insects or sometimes hummingbirds come to drink. Right? And you might say, well, the plant is doing something for the good of the insect or for the good of the hummingbird. Yes, but only partially, because it's a bribe to trick them to come there and sticking their faces in the flower. And thereby they get pollen on themselves, and thereby, when they fly after another one, they achieve the impossible for a flower, which is to have sex with a flower over there. Flowers can't move, okay? You're stuck on the ground. You need a partner over there. Insects and birds provide that, and they're bribed. So natural selection can explain that, but it's not something solely for the good of another species. Such a thing has never been found. Principle of divergence, we can discuss. This is the only illustration in The Origin of Species. And it's, well, it is quite important, but the following slide here, I'll let you study in your own time, which is Darwin's explanation of how this works. But basically, this is Darwin's explanation of how life works with the common ancestors at the bottom, here, these letters, and that these are the generations going on around each of the lines sprouting off as a different species. So that, very similar to his notebook B sketch that I showed you before, remember that little rough sketch in his notebook? So that here's the present, this timeline right here. So if we see this species, A, and this one, F, and this one, M, right? You would say, well, these are in the same family. And Darwin would say yes, because they're all descended from A. They have common ancestry. But A and F are much more similar. Look how much more common ancestry they share with each other. Much more is accumulated unique to them. It was not accumulated on this lineage. All these others are dead ends. They've all gone extinct. Okay? So only the ones that have reached this line right here are alive at the present. Now this diagram and shows this and other things. It does not represent any actual specific family of organisms. It's just describing a general process of branching evolution. And Darwin says, imagine thousands or 10,000 generations might separate individuals between, say, one line and another. So it's a very slow, gradual process that will very long period of time. That's the explanation you can read later.
I don't really understand.
Okay, chapter 5, laws of variation. Variation is not random. People who don't know anything about Darwin's theory often misrepresent it by saying it's
I don't
random.
see the diagrams.
I don't know where they get that from. It's not in Darwin. It's not about random. Variation isn't random. So, for example, the example of the cats. If they're white and they have blue eyes, then they're deaf. Why is that? And things are somehow connected together. It's not random. There are laws underlying these things which were almost completely unknown and not understood in Darwin's day. Genetics were basically the area to investigate that. But Darwin had various stabs at it. But natural selection, he argued, makes sense of what we would call rudimentary organs or throwbacks. So, for example, what's a good example of a throwback?
Hashtag throwback.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
I say first.
Sometimes human babies are born with tails.
Really? What?
It's unusual. Sometimes
Like tailbone, you also have, right?
other
I also
times
have.
it's longer ones.
I think so.
Lips
That's the
cut off
tail. I think.
in their babies.
Not sure.
And other organisms are sometimes born with things that don't belong to that species. These are called throwbacks. So, for example, if you had a chicken and it had teeth, which has never happened, I just made it up. But if you had that, that would be a throwback because no birds have teeth. Their beaks have teeth in them. And by the way, it's been found that they have the genes for teeth in them, but they just are not expressed anymore. But that's another lecture. That's coming in the future. Okay, experts can agree whether something is a species or variety. And he says there's no difference between a variety and an incipient species, or a species coming into being. Then he provides something that's very curious. He has a chapter on difficulties. And Darwin had thought of and addressed and answered all of the major objections to his theory himself. He's worked on it for 20 years. He's had plenty of time to work it all out. There were no major objections to his theory that he hadn't already thought of and provided answers for. This won Darwin a lot of converts because people were very impressed that he didn't just argue for a position that he believed in, but he took the objections very seriously. Almost everyone, I think, well, maybe very rich problem. Many people simply dismiss objections to their own views as it's the easiest thing in the world to do. We all do it. But to take such objections really seriously, consider them and answer them is quite a lot of work. And anyway, so this impressed many of his readers. So why are transitional varieties so rare? Darwin argued that they didn't last very long and soon disappeared. How could radical changes begin? How could a land animal become an aquatic one? Right? How could a bear become a whale, or a seal, or a dolphin? Something like that. Right? Such dramatic changes, if Darwin is right, have happened over a very long, slow period of tiny, tiny changes. It's often very hard to imagine a bear on one end and a whale on the other. They're so they're so very different that it's hard to imagine there could have been a line of intermediate animals between the two that were all viable and all successful between the two. Darwin argues there were. And that if you have to imagine any impossible thing in between, then that can't work. Many of his critics couldn't imagine things like that, so they thought they had found a flaw in his theory. So, what about organs that are incredibly perfect? So, for example, the eye. He says, to suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. You will find this quote from Darwin on thousands of web pages by creationists who neglect to give the sentences after it, where he then shows that, however, it can. And he shows that there are organisms alive in the world today that possess every degree of eye complexity you could possibly imagine. From simply slightly light-sensitive skin pigments on some creatures, like flatworms, that can basically only tell the difference between light and dark, all the way up to organisms like us or an octopus, which both have extremely complex and wonderful eyes, see beautiful color. But our eye and the octopus eye evolves independently. It's not the same. It's happened twice in these different lineages. So, here's the clip. Will it work? Yes.
Only designer of the human eye could be God. Anti-evolutionists maintain that the eye only work if it was complete in all its details. Darwin, on the other hand, argued that the eye had developed, becoming increasingly complex over a long period of time. That would only work if each stage of development was an improvement on the previous one. And today we know enough about the animal kingdom to know that that is indeed the case. Some very simple animals have nothing more than light-sensitive spots that enable them to tell the difference between light and dark. But if a patch of such spots formed even the shallowest of pits, one edge of the pit would throw a shadow and so reveal the direction of light. If the pit got deeper and started to close, then light would form a blurred image. Mucus secreted by the cells would bend the light and focus it. If this mucus hardened, it would form a proper lens and transmit a brighter and clearer image. All these different fully functional stages at different levels of complexity are found in living animals today. This single-celled creature has one of those light-sensitive spots. Flatworms have a small pit containing light spots, so they can detect the shadow of a predator. A snail's blurry vision is good enough to enable it to find its way to food. And the octopus has an eye with a proper lens and can see as much detail as we can. So the structure of the human eye does not demand the assistance of a supernatural designer. It can have evolved gradually, with each stage bringing a real advantage, as Darwin's theory demands.
Okay. Right. So then, here's another quote that I write. At the bottom of the slide there, Darwin writes, "I can indeed hardly doubt that all vertebrate animals, all animals with backbones, having true lungs, have descended by ordinary generation from an ancient prototype furnished with a floating apparatus or swim bladder. We can thus understand the strange fact that every particle of food and drink which we swallow has to pass over the orifice of the trachea, with some risk of falling into the lungs." What Darwin is pointing out there is that our anatomy bears the vestiges of these ancestral forms that he's hypothesizing here, which is why our air passage and our food passage are shared. There is no reason for them to be so, which is why we have the danger of choking, which is not very nice. So Darwin is arguing here that the lungs of vertebrates, and I think we now know that he was right. He was speculating that they are derived from the swim bladder of certain kinds of fish in the ancient world. Now, the swim bladder is just a little sac with an air bubble in it inside the fish, which the fish can control to make itself neutrally buoyant at different depths in the water. Many kinds of backbone fish have this. But for those that live in water that sometimes goes stagnant or that its oxygen becomes poor, those fish often have the ability to come up, you've probably seen this, and take a gulp of air. Where does it go? It goes inside the fish. Anyway, so they somehow acquire oxygen from this gulp of air. The swim bladder is lined with blood vessels that allow it to absorb oxygen when fresh air is taken in. So that was a structure that evolved to make a fish float at the right depth eventually came to be used as one that could sometimes supplement oxygen intake. And then its descendants became lungs, which are used only for oxygen intake and, well, coffee. I don't know what else allows it. Getting sick. Okay, chapter 6, difficulties on theory again. Why does a bee die after stinging? That's a good one, right? And the answer is, of course, you would think that's a pretty bad design. Why not just sting and sting, 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 sting? Why not just keep on stinging? Why sting and then rip your guts out with the stinger and flop off and die in 5 minutes? Well, okay, you could say there is the advantage that by pulling the guts out, the poison pack remains there, pumping poison into you through the sting, which is good for bee if you want to hurt your enemy as much as possible, but of course it does eviscerate the bee and it dies. Darwin points out that because the sting was originally a tool for something else. The stings of bees and wasps were originally, and many wasps have this tool still today, unmodified. It is called an ovipositor. It is a very pointy drill that can, that looks like a long hair sticking off the tail end of the wasp. They can drill through wood and other materials and deposit an egg deep inside, say, a fig or in the bark of a tree or something else. So this sharp tool on the end, which is for depositing eggs, could, of course, it's really sharp, can be used for defense. So you have a hollow needle at the back of your body for depositing eggs, and in their descendants, bees and the wasps with stings, this structure has become modified not to be a depositor of eggs, but to be a needle for injecting poison. Where's the venom? I always get the two confused. Is it poison or venom? No, it's venom. Venom is injected, poison is ingested. I've got that right. Somebody corrected me recently. So anyway, Darwin points out that if the power of stinging is useful to the community, even though the individual bee dies, it is defended its family, and its family passes on the characteristics anyway, even though the bee has died. Okay, so why are not all characteristics, we might say, why are not all characteristics adaptive? And he says characters which were formerly useful might persist simply due to inheritance. So, for example, the webbed feet of the upland goose, that's something you've seen in the Voyage of the Beagle. A goose that never sees water. It walks around all day on grass. But it has webbed feet. Why does it have webbed feet? It's sent from normal geese that use its web, and it still has the webbed feet. So it has a characteristic on its body that is not adapted for its way of life, because it never swims. And there are many other examples of that. The frigate bird, which is a seabird that also has webbed feet, and famously, no one has ever seen one land in the water. They fly over the ocean their entire lives. No one has ever seen one land, apparently, supposedly. They had to put a webcam on one. We'll find out if they had that. Anyway. The same bones in the arm of the monkey, the foreleg of the horse, the wing of the bat, and the flipper of the seal. There are no special use of these animals. We may safely attribute these structures to inheritance. And we'll get to that in another slide. Instinct. How is it that organisms do things by instinct? So, for example, a bee. When a queen bee gets, not a queen, yeah, when a queen bee or a queen ant flies up and makes a new colony, all of her offspring are born from eggs. They have never seen a colony before. They've never been in one. They've just been born in a brand new colony that has 0 bees or ants in it. And they're born out of their little eggs, and they start running around doing all the jobs of making tunnels and collecting food and all that. How do they know how to do that? Instinct. But how? So many people attributed that kind of amazing behavior to miracles. Just some kind of miracle state to do all that. Some people say Darwin's state. Darwin argued that all of these things could be explained by the effects of natural selection. Because of their relationship to each other. I'm not saying Hybridism, this was another mystery. Have you all heard of sterile hybrids like a mule? Which is what I put on the slide there. Let's see if I can remember this correctly. If you mate a horse and a donkey, those are the ones between the plus mark, you get a hybrid called a mule, which is neither a horse nor a donkey. A hybrid, and they are all sterile. Mules cannot reproduce, but they have characteristics different from both horse and donkey. So, some people argue that the reason when you make a hybrid, the reason they're sterile, people in Darwin's day argue that this was in order to keep nature neat and tidy and keep species from getting all mixed up and blended together. And there were lots of other philosophies to explain why does this happen, why does it exist. Darwin argued, no, there is no reason. It has not evolved for a purpose. It simply exists as an accidental byproduct of creatures that have diverged from each other, like the horse and the donkey, from recent ancestors, who are still similar enough that they can mate and something is born. But they're at the same time still so different from each other that the thing that they create is not a little donkey or a little horse. It's a crazy mixed up that is viable, it can live, but it's not reproductive. So this phenomenon has not evolved for any reason. It's simply a byproduct of lineages that are diverging from each other. The closer they are to each other, no problem. Which is why these are different species, but different varieties, or different races, no problem. We see that in all domesticated plants and animals, and let's face it, with people too. There is no reproductive problem between peoples of different races. They get married all the time, and they have babies that are perfectly normal and capable of reproducing on their own, right? Oh, and incidentally, it's been found out very recently, and I still can't quite bring myself to believe it, but apparently the evidence is very good from genetics. Apparently we interbred a little bit with Neanderthals before they went extinct, which would have been very similar to this. Neanderthals were a different species from us, but it looks like we have some of their DNA in us because they've actually extracted DNA from ancient Neanderthal bones. I don't know how they do that, but they did. And they found that, oh gosh, we've got some of that DNA in us. There's only one way to get there. From some prehistoric hanky-panky. But it also looks like that the amount of DNA from them is so small that it was probably very rare that any of the offspring from these pairings were fertile.
Hybrid with human.
So I have not heard this, my own speculation, I've heard no one mention this, but presumably there must have been a time when they were both humans and Neanderthals around and they were getting up to their hanky-panky, that there must have been a sort of hybrid, a mule, a human mule.
Yes.
Well, why not? If you have one between horses and donkeys, which never produce fertile offspring, and humans and Neanderthals only very rarely produced fertile offspring, such that we have a tiny bit of their DNA left. Does that mean that most of the time they did bear offspring, but it just was not fertile? Then there would have been a race of mules. Oh, bring that up in your philosophy class. What would the morals and ethics be? Could you treat them like slaves? Could you kill them? Would they have human rights? Oh, God.
Hybrid.
You ran a whole PhD on that.
Same thing. Cover one
Well,
test.
2 or 3, okay. Okay, next chapter. This one's very important. Chapter 9, Imperfection of the Geological Record. Now, you remember Lyell. Think back to Lyell and what his game was. He stressed the imperfection of the geological record because he did not want to accept what everyone else did, that it was progressive. That it had gone from simple to complex. Everyone accepted that except for Lyell, because he thought it was evolution. He was right. All those other people were not evolutionists, and they said that it's totally obvious that the geological record is progressive. is lineal. And he rejected it. And one of the ways he did so was to emphasize things that were perfectly true, but perhaps not sometimes overlooked, which was how imperfect the geological record is. And that was a very fair point to make, because it is very, very imperfect. And he made an analogy to imagine we had a book by some very fat book, Homer or something like that. And almost all the book was gone, and you only occasionally had a page or two from one of the chapters. And then he tried to reconstruct the history from just these few fragments. The fossil record is very similar to that. Well, Darwin, for different reasons, also emphasized, but quite rightly, the imperfection of the fossil record. So building on the work of his predecessor, but with his own angle, his own motive, which was that the reason the fossil record doesn't show us slow, gradual evolution, as Darwin is arguing in his book, is that it simply is too imperfect to show such a complete record. It isn't one. It is a tiny, fragmentary shred of what once existed. So he does this by showing that the conditions or the places on the Earth where fossils form are very few and very rare. It's only places where sediments are being deposited, which happens in water. Doesn't happen on land, doesn't happen in jungles. And so most of the fossils we have are shells, or things that live in the sea, other things like fish and sharks, and so forth. So the mammals and so forth that might be more interesting to us, we tend to get them fossilized where their dead bodies got buried by mud or got washed out in a river and got covered with sediment. And the conditions were right for fossilization, which they seldom are. So Darwin first stressed that the conditions of fossilization are very unusual and rare, therefore very few, very small, tiny percentage of things alive on the Earth at any one time would ever be fossilized. Vanishingly small. Then, imagine the things have to sit around in a churning, buckling, moving geological Earth with volcanoes and earthquakes and land being subducted and remelted and so forth, as geologists knew happened. And had to survive all of that for about 500 or 600 million years, which lots of them get melted or crunched or destroyed and so forth. So the survival. So fossilization is very rare, and the survival of fossils is somewhat unlikely. And then thirdly, they have to actually show up on the surface of the Earth, where us people scratching away at the very tiniest veneer of the surface will ever even see them. This is also vanishingly improbable. So Darwin made all of these points to show how incomplete the fossil record must be. And nevertheless, despite all those imperfections, we were able to reconstruct the general picture quite well. But we could not expect it to show us every single step of every single page. This is something that we cannot expect. Except for in some cases for things like, there are some species of I think mussels and things like that actually live in those environments which are perfect for fossilization. Those we do have amazingly perfect sequences showing their change over time. Yes, and then of course he stressed the vast lapse of time that had transpired, which could be deduced from the amount of strata that existed in the world. Here, I will just remind you of this illustration I've shown several times before from Buckland's Bridgewater Treatise. Remember, this is a pre-evolutionary diagram, but look how well it conforms with Darwin's explanation, both in terms of the immense age of the Earth, the progressive nature of the fossil record. Darwin has assimilated all of these major findings into his theory, saying, my theory explains the lot. Okay, now, here's another video.
By the 19th century, geologists had mapped out the rock formations of Britain. They have discovered that the North and South Downs are actually the remains of an ancient chalk mountain, nearly 50 miles across. Darwin's masterstroke is to try to calculate how many years it took for this huge mountain of chalk to erode and leave the gentle rolling countryside of the Downs we see today. If Darwin can work this out, it'll give him the age of this part of Britain.
20-30 feet down a cliff, what does that really represent?
Well, this represents here, as far as we've come, perhaps 100,000 years of cliff. You see, we've got these wonderful flint bands going as horizontal layers across the cliff. Each flint band representing perhaps 20,000 years of Earth's history. So there's a lot of time locked into these cliffs.
Modern geologists use sophisticated dating techniques to analyse the chalk in between the flint bands. Darwin has none of these methods to age rocks. Instead, he has ingenuity and the speed at which the sea erodes the chalk.
As you can see, these are wonderful white cliffs, and we can see they're cracked. And beneath us, the sea comes in, it breaks against the base of the cliff, it erodes it away.
So the sea's slowly eating away the rock and the rock then falls away?
Yes, and calculations, even in Darwin's day, were made on these cliffs. And Darwin used those calculations to work out the rate of erosion of the landscape in southern England.
Darwin takes the figure for cliff erosion, about an inch a century, and applies it to the ancient chalk mountain that had once existed. Now he can calculate how long the sea would have taken to erode the dome away. Here's how it goes. If the sea erodes an inch of chalk in 100 years, then to erode 1 mile of chalk, it will take the sea over 6.3 million years. To erode a chalk mountain nearly 50 miles across will take much longer, almost 50 times as long, and the total time, 306,662,400 years. Darwin estimates that the whole of southeast England is at least this age. And planet Earth must be even older. In fact, modern scientists have discovered that the Earth is at least 4 billion years old. With Darwin's clever calculation, he has everything he needs to make his theory work. Enough time for evolution to happen.
Yes, except Julie Doherty neglected to tell us that in fact Darwin's calculations were wrong. He in fact vastly overestimated the age of the Downs. We now know that that part of England is much younger than he estimated. So not everybody needs it right all the time. Okay, chapter 10 on the geological succession of organic beings. This should sound familiar because Darwin was talking about succession all the way back from when he returned from the Beagle voyage. So just remember some of these prominent examples which show the same creatures of the same family appearing in the same place. Right? So there was the Glyptodon, remember that one, this tank-like animal, succeeded in the same region by the bony armored armadillo today. The giant ground sloths that once existed in South America, same family has succeeded it in the same place in South America. Similarly with the giant killer kangaroo, although here he looks like he's having a really bad day. I don't know where I got that, just pulled it off Google somewhere. Anyway, but these ancient kangaroo monster things living in the same place where marsupial kangaroos only live today. In all these cases, you have through time the same family of things that are unique to that place persisting. So Darwin argued that the reason that they're like that is that they have been changing over time. And the things that live there today are the descendants of things that lived there long ago. That's why it's the same family. It's not something about the environment of Australia that makes marsupials be born there, or that only marsupials can live there, because we know from all the introduced creatures, anything can live there. It's great. All these other mammals like rabbits and humans, they're just running all over the place, making Australia awful. So that's Darwin's explanation. Descent. Geographical distribution. Okay. Many people think that biogeography is the most compelling evidence for evolution. So, if you look at the world, if you look at our planet, and why living, or where living things are distributed around it. As Darwin and Wallace and Humboldt and Buffon and people before them were always puzzled by these puzzles. Why are things spread around and distributed in these strange ways? And why are there only marsupials in Australia and these islands around it? Oh, but also there's some in South America. And why are there no frogs on oceanic islands? And so forth. These are curious puzzles, right? So, Darwin argued that the way things are distributed cannot be accounted for by the differences in the physical conditions. That is, the environments do not explain why things are where they are, totally. But according to Lyell's theory, remember, it should have. Things are there because they got created to fit it. That should be why things are where they are. Darwin says no, they're there because they've managed to reach it through natural means, or that they've simply been living there for a long time and are descended from their ancestors. So, take for example, oceanic islands and amphibians. Oceanic islands are those like the Galapagos, Mauritius, lots of islands, not Singapore. Singapore is not an oceanic island because if the water level sunk just a little amount, Singapore and Johor would be one piece of land. Oceanic islands are those that have never been connected to a continent, that are quite far out and remote. They're either volcanic or, in any case, they've never been connected to the mainland. So anything on them had to get there across the water. Oceanic islands, as a rule, as have been found, don't have amphibians on them, frogs and salamanders and newts. Why not? It has been found in Mauritius, for example, where frogs had been introduced by people until they became an absolute plague of frogs, because it was frog paradise in Mauritius. They loved it there. Big puzzle. The environment is obviously perfect for them. So why weren't they created there? Darwin argued the reason there aren't any amphibians on these islands is because they can't get there naturally. Their semi-permeable soft skins are killed by contact with salt water. Their eggs are little, if you've ever seen frogs spawn in the pond, they are permeable and will be destroyed by salt water. They don't have shells. They don't have shells on their eggs. They're just little blobs. They cannot reach oceanic islands through natural means, and so they almost never have. There might be one or two exceptions, but that's not the point. So, using things like that, Darwin argues that animals and plants have moved around, and the rest of our ancestors and their ability to do so has been limited by natural barriers. And so we can reconstruct the history of life. And these facts, yes, this is the point that Darwin makes, reiterates again and again. These facts make sense only in terms of his theory of evolution. There was no other theory that could explain them. They were otherwise inexplicable anomalies. Thanks. Okay, usual thing now, I've run out of time. Yeah, there's just simply too much content in these slides to get through today, and I wasn't even today, which is my fault. So we'll have to continue the tail end of this lecture next time. Okay, so we've run out of time. I know many of you have to get to your next lecture. So that's it for today. There's some books if anyone wants